Welcome, dearest friends, to another Cornish folklore episode. Today, we are going to take a wander once more among the beautiful and haunting coastline of Cornwall, wander the hidden villages and along winding lanes that crisscross the green countryside. Today we will learn about fairies and pixies, maybe witches and ghosts, and hear tales both strange and thought-provoking. Tales of dark Cornwall, of dark folklore, enchanting Cornwall and enchanting folk tales. At the end of the peninsula of Cornwall, as far as one could travel, is a strange-shaped piece of land. It looks like a finger, hooked, and it pokes into the sea. It's quite an appropriate description for the land, that some people call it a witchy finger, or a witchery finger. Cornwall, even to this day, has a multitude of witches, some of the most respected in all of the belief. And Cornwall is also proud home of fascinating museums, the Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle and the Cabinet of Folklore Museum in Falmouth. Cornwall is proud of its peculiar history and folklore, and so to this witch's finger of land, and almost to the centre of the curled joint's fingertip, where we find St. Buryan, a pretty village dating back hundreds and hundreds of years, and just south of this village was a tract of moorland, common land where the locals could graze their sheep and cattle. This land, as with a lot of common land, was not particularly great, hence it being land for the common folk. It couldn't be farmed very well, and much of this land was boggy ground. Marsh flowers and plants grew happily here, sheep and cattle didn't. Around and about, upon islands of merely damp ground littered with rocks, grew trees that could cope with a quite harsh landscape. Trees such as blackthorn and brambles and gorse were rife here. This land was dangerous too. Horses were able to pick their ways by instinct through the streams and wet ground that was sprinkled with a few farms here and there, scraping livings in this strange place, and reached by drier but still terrible paths. This place was called Selena Moor. Living well and flourishing in the parish village of St. Buryan was the ancient family of Noi. It was during harvest time that one middle-aged bachelor gentleman of the Noi family and some of his workers decided to make their way to nearby Burnwall, where lived relations of his family, and these were the Pendars. This was to be a rather large party of fine, hard-working fellows, and, deciding to make it an enjoyable harvest time event, Noi also invited along St. Buryan's parson, the clerk and the sexton. The sexton was a man renowned as a wonderful fiddler, and a storyteller or droll-teller as it was known locally. Also invited were more craftspeople of use for the reaping of the harvest, and some of the older poorhouse dwellers, so that they could join the harvest supper. Harvest by hand was hard work. The cutting and the stacking of golden corn was back-breaking, but the feasting, once it was done, was a fine thing to behold and be part of, and all were welcome to join in who had helped. One of the evenings, Noi and his dogs left the local pub to make his way to Burnwall to carry on with the harvest. But Mr. Noi never arrived. His relatives, the Pendars, simply thought he must have maybe had a few too many at the pub and made his way home. But he hadn't. Not that anyone noticed at first. The harvesting area covered many fields and farms, and the workers and farmers simply thought he must be at one or other of the other farms that were all helping each other. Once all the harvest was finished, it was time for the feast. And it was now that people started to wonder, where was Mr. Noi? They talked between themselves. Wasn't he at your farm? No, we thought he was at yours. It became worryingly clear that nobody had seen Noi since he had left the pub several nights ago. However, surely he was fine. He was healthy, he was a well-liked fellow, his horse was good, his dogs were good. He must be at one of the other festivals nearby, and for sure would arrive with more people as they arrived. And so the feasting and the corn gathering together continued. Friends became like family and workers became friends. Lovers' trysts were made. Good food was shared aplenty, copious amounts of cider and ale also. It was the very best of time. Songs were sung and dances danced merrily, and games were played with hilarity. The lady of the Pendar family sent riders out to find where Mr. Noi was staying, to invite him to come and enjoy the last of the feasts with them. He was so very much missed by all of them. And the feast at the Pendar farm was breaking up, and the riders began to return. Not one person in the whole of the area had seen or heard of Mr. Noi for days. Word spread fast among the crowd, worry and shock beginning to take hold of all. All of a sudden, people who were a little tipsy sobered very fast. Something had happened to Mr. Noi. Dawn would be upon them very soon. They arranged search parties among all of them, and vowed not to stop until they had found their missing friend. Men strode out on foot. Some took to horseback, searching the area and the mill ponds, fierce cliff edges, streams and rivers slowly paced in case he had fallen in. But they found nothing. Next day, riders visited all the further parishes to gather more searchers, and the search became wider. Further miles and miles were covered. Sadly, once more there was no sign of poor Mr. Noi. 2 days of fruitless searching by now had everyone exhausted, but they were still determined, despite the cold fear that caused many of them to look at each other and look at the floor. Words unspoken, but words very much understood. On the 3rd day of the searches, as the light was grey and clouds above, some of the searchers stopped to listen as the clear sound of dogs barking and a horse neighing came to them from Selena Moor, from near Pendray, where Noi lived. The place was so full of bugs and green-hued stagnant pools, surely he could not be in there. The noise was coming from a thicket of sharp gorse bushes where the land poked just high enough to stand proud from the wet ground. Not one of the searchers had even considered looking here because it was too close to Noi's home. He would have made it home safely from here easily. A small group of men stepped forwards, willing to search the mire, picking their way carefully where they could discern passable paths. There were the dogs, Noi's dogs, and his horse, who was grazing happily. The dogs, though, were in a pitiful state, half-starved, terrified. At the sight of the searchers, both dogs and the horse came to them. The dog's relief was obvious, the horse's eyes and ears relaxed. Now the dogs and the brave horse encouraged the men to follow them. They led the men through the thicket and to where larger trees stood, and within the trees an abandoned building. What it was or what it had been, nobody even knew, because nobody had been fool enough to come here ever to this wild, desolate place. The horse stopped at the doorway, pawing at the stone step with its hoof. The dogs, encouraged now by the men, pushed through the brambles and fallen stone into what was left of the building, and here they found him, Mr. Noi, ragged, unkempt, thin, pale skin looking dry and haggard. He was sleeping almost close to death. Little by little they gently roused their friend, and as his eyes opened in the daylight he looked confused. Why were they there, on Harvest Feast Day? Where was he? Had his dogs brought them here? He was in a dreadful state, confused and very sick. They encouraged him to drink a little brandy and lifted him out of the ruins and carried him across the mire. The horse and the dogs picked their way alongside them. They spoke softly to him, explaining he was very close to home. But he looked all around himself and he recognised nothing, until they carried him across the stream that divided the farmlands, and now his senses began to return, but he couldn't believe it. How had he been missing for 3 days and nights? Noi was carried to the farm and made warm. Seated by the fire, warm food was prepared and warm drink. As he sat there, he began to tell his strange tale. When he had left the pub that night, it was beautifully clear. Everything was sharp and in focus as day, and so he decided he would take some time with a shortcut across the moor. It would save him so much time. He had done this so many times in the past, and his horse well knew the path and how to pick its way through the dangerous places. His horse was not happy with any of this, though, and rider and horse pulled this way and that until he found himself in the area where he had been found. Although he had known all of the moor since a child, nothing now looked familiar. He had finally given the horse the reins, and it had taken a path to and through the trees, so thick that he could not see the end of the woodland. He knew this strange landscape, though, had gone on for miles and miles as they walked and walked through trees. At last he could hear jolly music and could see the warmth of glowing light and could make out many people moving in the distance. It must be the harvest feast, one of the farms that finished work and begun to celebrate already. He decided to move forwards and head to this place, relief at last flooding him, and yet the dogs and the horse refused to move. They were too distressed. Tired now and sick of it all, he tied his horse to a tree and left the dogs. Mr. Noi had walked forwards and come to an orchard strung with pretty lights, and then to a meadow. Here were hundreds of fine people, some eating and drinking, some dancing and singing, and all led by a lady, all dressed in white, who played a tambourine while standing on a stock nearby the house door. He noticed the revellers were rather small, and the cups and the plates and such were small also. The dancers were so deft and fast that he could not even see their feet, so fast were they flying at the jigs and reels. The lady in white was more his size, and this dance ended. She turned to an old fellow standing by her and nodded. Maybe she was his daughter, Noi mused. She now dipped into the house and returned with the drink, which she poured for all, and then began to beat a new tune with her tambourine. He became aware that some of the revellers and the girl were casting sly glances at him, and before long he found he wanted desperately to join them in the dance. He could not help himself. She and the dance was too entrancing. However, now the girl's eyes clouded with alarm, and she made quick motion for him to hide behind the house, to duck away and under cover. Mr. Noi, though, could not move one muscle to leave, but instead felt his feet slowly drawn to the crowd. The girl looked even more alarmed now and called to the little old man and whispered to him. He now began to play as the dancers danced. The girl tripped lightly towards Mr. Noi and beckoned him to follow her, and of course he did. The girl waited for him in the moonlight glade nearby the building, and as he came nearer he realised he recognised her. It was Grace Hutchins, one of the farmer's daughters from nearby. He had loved her long and devotedly until she had passed away, not 3 or 4 years ago. He had been bereft, mourning her and visiting her grave in St. Buryan churchyard. So how was she here, with these strange people? When she was quite close by her, she spoke to him, her dearest William. She warned that she had to save him, or he would have been turned into one of the little folk as she had. He moved to kiss her. He loved her still, but she stepped back, and now a warning. He must not touch her, nor eat flower or fruit or a drop of liquid or food. She had eaten a plum from this ancient orchard, and she had been trapped here since, for heaven knows how long. She knew her friends and family, and her love thought her long dead upon the moor. But what had been found was a changeling body. It was not her. She lived here now, and she always would for eternity. Small voices shouted from the glow of the nearby buildings for her to fetch more beer and more cider. Grace told him to follow her. She would help him hide, but he must touch nothing, eat nothing, and drink nothing. His throat was as dry as dust, but even as he begged for something, she refused him anything to drink. The danger was all too real, she said, and she would not have him trapped here as she was, a servant to the good folk. As she helped him hide, she told him he would never know how much she loved him, and she always would. For this love she would save his life. She led him to a garden seat and told him what had happened to her. Many years ago she had been walking at dusk, looking for the farm sheep that had strayed onto the moorland. She had heard him calling to his dogs near his home at Pendray and decided that she could rush to be with him and they could spend some time walking together. But as she walked, she had lost sight. The ferns were so tall that their leaves were high above her, and now the ground was soft and wet and sinking. She seemed to have walked and walked for miles, eventually crossing a stream and finding herself in an orchard. Music was playing somewhere, and as she went looking for the people who could help her, she passed through the most beautiful gardens full of flowers, with trees bursting with sweet scented ripe fruit. Now she tried to find her way from the gardens, but everywhere seemed blocked to her in one way or another. She was Piskies led this way and Piskies led that. The music was a constant, although no figures could be seen. By now it was dark and she was extremely hungry. She plucked a plum from one of the branches and took a bite, and as she did so, the sweetness turned bitter in her mouth. She was sick everywhere and collapsed in a fit to the floor. When she came to and awoke properly, she was surrounded by small people, hundreds of them, and they told her that she must stay with them now. She would be their servant and care for their sickly children. She would clean and cook and entertain them. They were exceedingly happy to have found her in their garden. At first she had been impressed and enchanted by their fine glamour, but over time had come to see it was all show and all a sham. They had no true emotions. She felt that they had once been human maybe, and only acted a bitter memory of emotion. She did not really know. The garden was the same. The plums and the apples were really only bitter sloe berries of the blackthorn, or rotting blackberries. The beautiful cultivated flowers truly were only bog and moorland plants. It was like a magical glass. Her diet here was watered honey. She missed real food a lot, salt fish and meat. She looked forwards though to when they brought stolen goat milk from animals they had lured onto the moor to be milked. This was primarily for the sickly fairy babies, but then everyone had a taste too. Sometimes there would be whole herds here being milked. She told him that some of the little people would place themselves in sheep or goat form among the lost herds and flocks and guide the animals to the milking grounds. These decoys were the oldest and wisest of these people. They sported long beards and the beadiest and slyest of black eyes. She looked at her love and sighed. She had become used to life here. They did treat her kindly, especially the elderly fellows. The one she had been speaking to was enamoured of her and would do anything for her. At this Noi looked crestfallen, but she smiled. The little man was nothing. He was as air. Her love for William Noi would never ever end. Noi asked, were there any small children among these creatures, other than those they stole from human homes? She explained that the small people loved new babies above all else, and the fathers were as vain could be in their strutting, despite being ancient and withered fellows who usually just wished they could dissolve to nothing, so tiresome had their existences become. Grace told William that she had been given a gift, to be able to change to the shape of any bird, and she had been this way, nearby him on many times, watching him with so much love, even though he had not known. When he died, he would be given the choice of coming to live here in this land of the fairies with her. Once more the small people, though, were now shouting for Grace and ale and beer. Grace left him to fetch them more drink. Noi devised a plan. He would try and save Grace and bring her home. He knew the local fairy law. He would turn a garment inside out and throw it into the middle of the ring, take control of the situation, and they would be free. In his pocket he found his gloves and turned one inside out and placed it inside a stone and threw it right into the centre of the dancing circle. Instantly everything vanished. Grace, the house, the fairies, the table, all the food, all the drink. Nothing was left but ruins, thickets and withered trees. And then there was a bang on his head, and he fell to the floor, senseless. And to him, he had only slept for a few hours. The listeners nodded in their heads. They had been warned by the older, wiser folk for so many years who knew about fairies. They were once human, caught in the land of fairies, eventually becoming smaller and smaller until they disappeared completely. On hearing this, he realised that some of the fellows did resemble local family faces. It was a curious thing indeed. Mr. Noi recovered physically, but was never quite the same mentally again. Every small bird he came across he fancied was his love Grace come to visit him, and he pined for her so much. She was alive, yet not alive. He would wander the moor on moonlit nights, searching for her and calling for her. Over time his interest in life disappeared. He had no interest in hunting, fishing, or spending time among friends or family. And before the time of the next harvest, after this strange adventure, William Noi had pined away and passed from this mortal world. Or had he? Because maybe he found Grace waiting for him as she had promised, and they now live in the shadow world together still. The very end of the long peninsula that is Cornwall is called Land's End. Nowadays nearby is a commercial venture, but the original coast and black rocks with swelling seas here is still very impressive. To gaze out across the sea and wonder what would be the next point of land, and where was the famous mythical lost land of Enys, now swallowed by the waters. Here we find the granite headland known as Gwenep Head, or in old times called Tolpedon Penwith. This is a ladder-like cliff. Climbers now use it to practice on and have fun and test their mettle. And atop this peculiar-looking stairway of granite is a natural basin that is known as Match Figgy's chair. And who was Match Figgy? Well, she was once a most feared woman, a witch of renown, and the most vicious wrecker. The wreckers were a terrifying bunch of thieves and murderers who were found all along the coastal waters of Britain, where trading and passenger ships were frequent. These despicable people would often light lamps to confuse the ships' crews as to where the coastal villages were, tempting ships to perform dangerous manoeuvres around the coasts. Cornwall's hidden rocks beneath the waves would cut through wooden hulls of ships like scissors through fabric. The ships then caught on the rocks. The crews and passengers would try to reach the land. Many would lose their lives at sea. Those who managed to gain ground and crawl from the sea foam to the soft sand, or even climb the rocky shore, would then lose their lives at the hands of the wreckers. The cargoes that the ships had carried would wash ashore, or the thieves would take to small boats to salvage what they could steal and sell. It was a way of life for many coastal community members in Cornwall, this and also smuggling to avoid taxes due to the crown. Match Figgy was the leader of one of these wrecker bands. In all weathers she would climb to her chair and watch with beady eyes as the wind howled around her and the salty sea crashed against her rock, soaking her with each wave, often rain pelting her thin frame, but she neither noticed nor cared. The locals far and wide were terrified of Match Figgy, also a black witch, a dark witch, able to hurl curses and cast dark spells from her perch upon the rocks. She was one of the leaders of the Cornish witches. On broomsticks she and her coven would take to the skies, speeding to far away lands. Nobody knew where. Their harsh laughs and cries, though, could be heard high above in the dark night. Match Figgy's cottage could be found not too far from her perch, and here her wrecker gang lived and gathered also. They were known to be the most dangerous of all the wreckers of the Cornish coast, bloodthirsty rogues who had no pity at all. Not even children or babies were safe. And it wasn't the fact that they stole riches and made good money from the thefts, but these men and women loved the hunt and the destruction and the killing. The wreckers from this gang were easy to spot around towns and villages, an arrogance and a superiority, flaunting rich clothes and jewels that they had stolen, coarse and filthy killers dressed in a mockery of those that once owned the dresses and the fine coats, the necklaces and tiaras. And of these, the worst looking and most ridiculously dressed and most unscrupulous were Match Figgy and her husband. Among most wreckers of the coast, the saying, "Honour among thieves," held strong. Each gang had their patch and respected the borders. Not Match Figgy, though, or her gang. Everyone was fair game in their hunt and destruction. There was a fierce storm raging one day as she sat in her chair. Excitement bubbled in her, an unnatural excitement. This was perfect weather for shipwrecks, and she and her gang had lured a ship too close for saving already. At the foot of the granite stairway where the perch was, a ship was trapped upon sharp rocks, a Portuguese West India ship. It rose with each swell and was smashed down to the black rocks again and again and again. The old woman screamed her laughter into the storm and danced madly. This would have riches beyond compare. Portuguese West India ships always did. Below her the cries and screams of those in peril were like music to her evil ears. Little by little the cries became silent, and all that was left was the crashing of the waves and the wrenching of the wood shattering on rock. Now was time for her and her gang to act. Once down from her perch, Match Figgy and the gang descended like vultures upon the fallen. Even the long hair of the women was cut off for wig making. Nothing was left unsearched. Everything was taken. Bodies were dragged to Perlo Cove, to a hollow there, and dumped unceremoniously. Now, one of the bodies found and claimed by Match Figgy herself was quite a curious one. This female was more richly dressed than any of the others. Her jewels shone brighter than anything the wreckers had ever seen before, and they had seen some stuff. Hidden among the body's clothes were vast quantities of more jewels and coins, and every hem and trimming hid more and more wealth. Match Figgy picked this poor woman bare, as a carrion bird would a carcass, and all her gang watched greedily, as the riches piled high at their leader's feet. But as she carried out her vile task, her eyes grew dark and then afraid, and the whites of her eyes were soon larger than the jet-black irises. She snapped at the crew. Not one of this woman's things must be touched. The gang began to argue with her, and then among themselves, but Match Figgy shouted to them to silence, and nobody would dare go against her will. This woman, she explained, had witches' marks upon her. As a witch herself, she knew these, and knew this was a very powerful witch that they had murdered. All of the woman's treasure was placed in a chest, taken to Match Figgy's cottage. None of it was to be touched. The body was then taken to the pit where the others lay, and thrown in and finally buried, all of them together. As darkness fell that night, a small blue light rose from the mass grave. It made its way silently over the land and rose higher and higher, until it reached Match Figgy's chair. Here it stayed a while, just hovering over the granite seat. And then without a sound, it drifted to the old witch's cottage, and floated through the doorway to the chest of the dead lady's belongings. Every wrecker in that room saw that blue light and followed it. With wide, horrified eyes, Surely this ghost light was here to curse them. But Match Figgy scoffed. If any had not the mettle to deal with a tiny light, then they could leave her and leave her company also. She had no tolerance for cowards. Not one of them dared to leave, because to do this would be their doom, because Match Figgy would take their lives also, just in case tongues loosened by booze began spilling secrets in the local pubs. For 3 long months this little blue light would rise in the darkness from the grave every single night, head to the granite outcrop, and then float to the cottage and wait over the great oak chest. Every single night. After 3 months, another peculiar thing happened. By now, the wreckers had become quite paranoid about this blue light. It seemed to taunt them. They knew something would happen, but knew not when or how. On the last day of the 3rd month, a stranger came to the cottage, a man obviously foreign, but from where, no one could tell. This man was silent, and this man was terrifying in his silence. It was Match Figgy's husband who was alone at home when this man arrived, and the old man was scared to death of him instantly and greatly, not only because of the fear of strangers at their den, but also because of the man's strange way of communicating through hand gestures and signs. Surely he was insane, the old man thought, and so with that unpredictable and possibly extremely dangerous. The persistence of the stranger eventually calmed the old man a little though, and by signs he made himself understood that he wished to visit the grave of those who had died upon the rocks from the Portuguese ship. Old Figgy sighed in relief. The man had no clue as to the real reason of the graves. He donned his cap and began to lead the way to the hollow. But on the pathway there, the stranger pushed the old man out of the way. He ran to the exact gravesite and to where the wealthy witch woman had been buried, and here Figgy watched as the man threw himself on the woman's grave and sobbed uncontrollably. Figgy was motioned to leave. The old man tore himself away, leaving the foreigner bereft upon the grass. Night drew in, and it was dark and still, and the stranger still had stayed upon the grave of the wealthy witch. Now the blue light rose from where he rested, but it did not go to the high seat this time. Instead it rose and began to drift along the path towards the cottage. The man rose and followed the light. If he stopped, it would come to him, and then lead on, urging him to follow once more. At the cottage it drifted through the door as usual, and the man followed. The wreckers inside, expecting the light as usual, did not expect the stranger. As he walked into the room they stood to stop him, but he was beyond them all, and he simply swept them from his way in his strength. And now the light hovered over the chest, and here it began to shine brighter than they had ever seen. The stranger brushed all the heaped stuffs from the top of the chest, all of the rubbish that had been lain there, and opened the great lid, and there inside were the belongings of the wealthy witch. His eyes told that he recognised what he was looking at, and he closed the chest quietly. He turned to the wreckers, and they feared the worst. But instead, he went to each of those assembled there, and gave them one after another a gift, and then saying nothing, he strode through the door and into the pitch-black night. Stunned silence was left in the cottage. Nobody ever found a clue as to who this man had been, or where he was from, or where he even stayed. But from the night of his visit to the cottage, that blue light was never ever seen again. A story was told to the author of one of the older folklore books, to a William Bottrell. He was at a pub near Zena on the Witchy Finger of Cornwall, a beautiful area of the country and one full of ancient standing stones and Neolithic Bronze Age sites. It's a fascinating area for anyone who wants to absorb the atmosphere of ancient mysteries. We don't truly know who built these ancient stone artefacts. The stone builders are somewhat a mystery to us still. Theory abounds, of course, and archaeology comes up with some wonderful evidence, but who they actually were is a mystery. that I hope we will never solve. Mysteries are often perfect just as they are. What we do know, though, is that this area is steeped in ancient history from the ancient people, and folklore and fairy lore infuses this part of Cornwall. And so to our strange story. The landlord had come into the pub. This was a strong man, middle-aged and brown as a berry. His main role was as a farmer, a large farm for the area of Zena, and his wife was left as landlady for the pub. As the night drew on and the pub regulars and visitors became more genial, the landlord began to tell his tale, told to him by his wife about smugglers and fairies. These small people had been sighted many times dancing on the plot of land known as Eastern Green. Now, in our modern time, Margaziow is known as Market Jew area of Penzance, and a lot of land was taken by the encroaching seas. But once green fields and sandy banks lay here, and it was a pleasant vista to travel through, and this is where our tale is set. There was once a man called Tom Warren, hailing from the village of Paul, and he was known as one of the canniest smugglers in the area. It was a summer night when he and 5 other fellows had brought their boats ashore nearby to Longrock. The boat was filled with smuggled goods. 2 of the men took brandy and fine salt and other riches from the boat and began to make their way to Market Jew area of Penzance. Here were clients waiting to spend good coin on the treasures. Another of the men hastened to Newtown to bring horses to move the rest of the cargo to safety before the arrival of the customs and excise men. Exhausted after their long night's work, Tom and the remaining 2 smugglers lay down near the goods to get some sleep until the return of their friends. It was not too long, though, before they could hear strange tweets as reed whistles and the rattling of something that sounded like an old woman tapping pewter plates. The men looked at each other confused a while, but decided it must be the noise travelling on the night air, maybe revellers dancing upon the green. Tom was not happy, though. He did not want witnesses to what they were doing. It was, after all, a serious crime. He climbed to the green to tell them to move on. As he neared the hollows and the mounds, he could see many beautiful lights and people dancing, and all of them were dressed so finely, but in the strangest clothes. In the middle of the group was a slightly higher mound, and here were sat many little old fellows playing music upon the pipes, tambourines, whistles and reeds. The men had long, fine beards, and their clothes were bright leafy green, and their heads were covered in red caps. They were such a funny-looking crew that Tom was quite amused by it all and could not help himself but to call out, "Will he be shaved? Will he be shaved, old red caps?" Twice he called to them, and just before the 3rd shout, hundreds of little eyes turned in his direction. And after this, hundreds of bows with sharp glinting arrows and spears were also turned in his direction. Now the pixie band changed tune and began to play a military march, and all of the Spriggans and Fairies and Pixies began to march towards Tom. As they get closer, they began to grow in height, and their faces became terrifying. Tom picked himself from his spying place and ran as fast as his legs could carry him back to the beach in the boat, heart pounding like a drum. His lungs were burning, and as he ran across the beach, he gasped desperately, "Put to sea for your lives, there's thousands of small people and buckaboos, most on our backs, they'll soon surround us." Tom was running past the other 2 by now, and he was almost at the boat himself. A shower of beach pebbles hit 3 men, and these burned like red-hot coals upon the smuggler's skin. All 3 men shoved the boat into the water and leaped inside, grabbing the oars and rowing for their very lives. At last they felt safe enough to stop. No fairy folk would enter the salt water, and panting they looked back to shore. There, back on the sands, they could see the ugliest, most frightening creatures they could imagine. These beings were throwing pebbles and making threatening gestures. Fearing for their lives, should they row back to shore, the 3 men stayed bobbing around in the boat until dawn. and now they could hear their comrades returning with the horses, and the fairy creatures also heard this. They retreated to the dunes and hid. Only now did Tom and his friends start to row back to dry ground. As they neared the shore, Tom shouted after the fairies, "We'll shave ye all and cut your tails off if you ever show here any more." The fair folk, though, they took no notice at all. The returning smugglers asked what had been the problem. Was it one of the spotters for the excisemen? Had they set back to sea to avoid being noticed? But no. He said he would explain later. And later he did, as they tapped a keg of booze and shared a drink or three. All their friends and neighbours arrived to buy a little alcohol and sharing the listening to this very weird tale. Tom told them everything. Most believed every word. They knew the fairy lore of the area already. They warned him he should not have given such foul words to them. They would have their revenge because fairies always did, and he would have bad luck, they said. And within a year his luck did turn bad. But for that night and many onwards, Tom and his mates lived to tell the tale and lived to smuggle another boatload. And the fairy folk? Well, it seemed they departed that place after being mocked by Tom Warren, because their pride could not bear to have them stay. Now we come to a very tragic tale, and one I must give fair warning about, as it is about changelings. So if you might be upset by this tale, please do skip to the next Cornish tale in this episode. I would hate for one of our listener friends to be upset, as it is about child abduction. Once there lived a couple so very much in love, and their marriage was one of smiles and pure joy. They were Mr. and Mrs. Davies. The wife was a very pretty young thing, and her husband caring and devoted. He was a waggoner by trade. Their cottage was small, but well kept, with cob walls or adobe mud for our friends across the pond, and the garden was full of flowers and herbs all spring and summer long, like a painting come to reality. Another garden was full of vegetables and fruit, and this plot was a few minutes' walk away from the cottage at the top end of the cliff. The happy couple had one child, a nearly new baby only a few months old. She was like a little doll, she was so pretty, and such a happy baby too. As far as her parents felt, she must be the prettiest baby in all Cornwall. But there was a danger hidden on all of this, because the baby had been seen by the fairies, and they too believed she was the prettiest of all the babies of Cornwall. One day, while preparing a stew for her husband's supper, the wife found she had no potatoes to add to the meal. Never mind, she thought, she would simply run to the vegetable garden and fetch some straight from the good ground. She tied on her sunbonnet, and as she made for the door, the little baby began to cry dreadfully. The young mother realised her baby knew that she was leaving her, and smiling lifted the child from her crib, took down a basket for the potatoes, and left the house for the vegetable garden, all the while chattering happily to the baby. At the garden she stopped and stood by the cliff, her corn-blonde hair playing in the breeze from the sea below. It was such a beautiful summer day, the sea so blue and like a mill pond, it sparkled like blue polished glass. She found a safe place to lay the baby near some pretty flowers, and once the child was amused playing, the mother began to dig around for a few potatoes. It was not so long after she started digging that she heard a strange sound, like leaves of trees rustling in the wind. But there were no trees, and there was no wind. She dropped her trowel to see where the noise was coming from, and as she did so she was caught in a fairy wind, a whirlwind that spun her around and around and around, and as she spun she was surrounded by a fine grey dust until she could see nothing at all, and in her heart she knew it was fairies. At last the dust thinned and the wind dissipated, and she was so close to the edge now that she could have almost fallen over it, and she saw she was such a long way from her baby. She ran to the safe space she had left her daughter and cried in despair, because there where her beautiful baby had been was now a wizened ancient thing, face scored with deep lines and wrinkles, twisted nose, spiteful thin lips and beady black eyes. She screamed into the summer air. "That is not my little maid. It is a changeling. The wicked little people envied us our little beauty and have stolen her away and left one of their own ugly little brats in her place. They raised a fairy whirlwind to hide from me what they were doing, the wicked, wicked little things." The poor young mother had no idea how long she stood there defeated, crying her eyes out, staring at the strange thing lying where once her child had. Sighing at last, she did as she knew fairy law must dictate. She picked up the thing, so like a tiny old woman, and carried it back home. There her husband welcomed her back, relieved. He had come home and found the house empty. He had been about to come and look for her. But now she told him everything and showed him the changeling child. What should she do? He simply turned from her and the fairy creature and wept. They decided they must keep the strange little thing and care for it as well as possible, and maybe that way the fairies would look kindly on them and bring their own baby back. And this they did. They cared for the changeling and were very kind to it. Every day they hoped that the fairies would come and change the two babies back. But it wasn't to be. Only a year after the stealing of the beautiful baby, the fairy child, as they called the changeling, passed away and died. And their own little child, their beautiful golden-haired child, she was never seen again by human eyes. Many years ago, the village of Treen, nearby Logan Rock, was a popular market meeting place, especially for tin miners and streamers. These men would come from the tin fields and mines near Penberth to trade and to meet. To protect this important site, a fort was built to protect the tin miners and the mines. The traders would come from far and wide across the seas, but they were never allowed past the cove below the fort, so they could not learn of the whereabouts of the mines. It was a busy industrial place and always full of people coming in and out. Now, one day a group of tinners from nearby Tregarthen and Kernow came to Treen. These poor men met to talk about what to do. Their mines had failed. There were tales told of more tin to be dug near Penzance, but the thought of moving there did not fill them with glee. One of them, older than the rest, offered to go and see if it was worth all of them moving site, and this man was Tom Tregarthen. He would go, he would dig around, if fortunes looked better he would send for his mates. The day of his leaving, people came from far and wide to bid him good luck and farewell. He was such a well-liked fellow. His wife broke down in tears. He was not much better at leaving her. Steeling himself, he set off on his long walk. Finally he came to the village of Goldsmithny, where he bumped into one of the merchants that he knew. And this man searched for tin on top of the tin grounds and sold his tin at St. Michael's Mount. He was delighted to see Tom, an experienced streamer. This would increase his tin yield a plenty. Tom prepared to give this new venture a go, and he took a contract for a year. He would be given just enough to live on and a share of the profit. Tom worked damn hard that year. He knew everyone was waiting to hear of his success back home, other lives depending on him. At the end of the year, the two men had done well, but Tom's share of the money was, well, not really that great. The merchant asked him to stay for another year, and Tom wasn't sure. It hadn't been his plan at the beginning. However, the merchant persuaded him to send for his friends back home. They could achieve more working all together. One piece of advice kept sticking in his mind. Never leave an old road for a new one. Back home, most of the tinners were afraid to leave their homes and area, and so only 2 or 3 followed Tom to these new tin grounds. A year of hard graft passed, and Tom worked harder than everyone else altogether, and this time there was even less money. Never leave an old road for a new one. Never. They stayed for a 3rd year, and this was even worse. Fed up with the lot, the friends, downhearted and dispirited, decided it was time to go home. Now, Tom had been a great favourite with his master and the master's wife. He was always well liked, and he was always such an honest fellow. When the men left the village, his master's wife gave Tom a lovely homemade currant cake that she had baked just for him, and she told him he must remember, never leave an old road for a new one. The Tinners, all of them, made their way along the roads until they were soon to the west of Penzance. It had been such a long time since they had come this way on their way to building new life with new tinning grounds and their hearts full of hope. It had been so long, in fact, that a completely new road had been built in that time. They were quite exhausted, and it looked like this new road could save them many miles. They would be home soon, so much quicker on this new road, but Tom, somehow remembering the advice of his master's wife and that repeated saying that always played in his head, never leave an old road for a new one, well, he decided he wouldn't leave the old road for a new one at all. No, he said to them, never leave an old road for a new one. They laughed at their superstitious friend and agreed to meet up later at home, and now they bade farewell for the time being. Tom slowly and steadily made his way along the old road, and when he reached the junction of the old and the new roads, sat down to rest for a while. He'd take a little food given to him by his master's wife. She had given him a little extra so he could keep the currant cake for his return home to share with his wife and his family. He sank to the grass and stretched out tired legs. He'd not been sat long when he heard shouting, and looking up he saw all of his friends running along the new road towards him. He had thought they must be miles in front by now. He stood amazed. What's happened? They stood by him, shivering and shaking, their breaths coming in panic gasps, full of bruises and cuts as well. They managed to tell him that they had been on the new road when robbers attacked. They had stolen all of their pitiful amount of money and beaten them black and blue. Tom remembered the advice and how for such a long time that had always played in his mind. That advice had saved him. Finally, after many more miles, Tom reached his home and his wife. She was so happy to see him. She made hot tea and he gave her the currant cake. This, he said, was all his payment for 3 years' work. This and a piece of good advice. Never leave an old road for a new one. Tom's wife was astonished. This was what she sacrificed 3 good years without a husband for, a bloody currant cake. Did he know how hard it had been for her, virtually penniless for 3 years, scraping by? That was it. She had had enough. She picked up the full currant cake and threw it at his head. You old fool. Tom stepped aside to avoid the flying cake, and instead it hit the side of the dresser. The cake burst open in a shower of pieces of cake and crumbs and currants and shining gold coins. At first they were speechless, and then the shock broke, and then laughter and smiles. His wife ran for the priest. There was a note, and neither of them knew how to read. The priest came running back with Tom's wife and read the note, smiling all the while. He told them this was a precise account of each year's profit that Tom alone had earned. His master and mistress had kept it safe for him, and both of them, knowing the dangers of the new road, wanted to keep Tom safe, so they had hidden everything in the currant cake. The old couple now had enough money for Tom to retire, and they lived quite comfortably all the rest of their years. Never leave an old road for a new one. Once, when the hills of Boslow were covered in a blanket of soft white snow, it heralded one of the worst winters in memory. The only widow who lived in the hamlet tiptoed into the barn and left a bowl of Gertie milk there. This was boiled milk and oatmeal, and it was a much larger bowl than usual, because the night was so very cold, and she worried that the pixies might freeze. It was a frosty moon night, one of those where even the slightest breath creates a puff of steam and a silvery light of the moon leaves everything sparkling. She had left the bowl for the pixies and then crept around for a while, and then returned to peep inside the barn to see if the pixie was already there. She so wanted the pixie to have a hot meal. As she peered into the darkness of the barn, she could see a little moonlight from the small window, and sat on a sheaf of oat straw was the Piskey, and he had found the bowl of hot Gertie milk she had left, and also a wooden spoon. Soon he was smacking his lips and licking his fingers. She was so happy for him, poor thing as he was. The Piskey stretched and began to start his threshing work within the barn after his hearty meal. But as the widow watched and her eyes became used to the darkness, she was horrified. The poor little fellow had nothing but rags. His breeches were more holes than fabric, and the fabric of his tunic was paper thin. He must be freezing cold all the time. She closed the barn door and made a promise to herself. She was going to make this little Piskey a new little warm outfit. She would give him some of her husband's old clothes, but she knew pixies were very proud and would not wear cast-offs. Within a couple of days she had made a matching coat and breeches, knitted long stockings from black sheep wool, and also knitted a lovely warm cap. That night she placed the tiny clothes with the Gertie milk bowl and the spoon and tiptoed from the barn. The same as last time, she left a few minutes and then returned to secretly watch the pixie. He sat eating his Gertie milk, looking suspiciously at the bundle. Once he had finished the oatmeal, he jumped down from his sheaf and poked the clothes with a toe. And then he began to lift each garment to the moonlight. And then he pulled all of the perfect little things over his bare skin, and he began to dance in the rays of the moon that shone through the little window. Piskey fine and Piskey gay, Piskey now will run away. And he did. Right off through the door where the old widow stood peeping, and slipped right through as quick as a flash, pausing only to doff his cap at her and shout, "I wish ye well till I see you again." And off he went, much to the old woman's shock and amazement. And do you know, he was never seen again. Not there, or anywhere else, for that matter. So, there, my dearest pals, we have some more Cornish folk tales, and I hope you enjoyed them as much as I did. I am so happy to be bringing stories to you from Cornwall now, as well as Devon. There is much tongue-in-cheek competition between the two counties. Which county spreads the cream and the jam on the cream teas the right way, who invented the pasty. All of these poking the ribs type things. Really, it doesn't help having a river as a border between the two sister counties either. Natural borders always seem more substantial. However, what we must remember is that both Devon and Cornwall in northern France were all part of Celtic areas. And Cornwall, Devon and Brittany were all the places of the Dumnonii. I'll be back soon with some more Cornish stories, and in the meantime, until then, take care, dearest friends, brightest of blessings, and remember, don't you go playing with the fairy folk now, or you may end up in one of my folk tales yourself.